Welcome everybody to our 2024 Studer Banquet. I'm Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society, and my internet is very in and out right now, so I'm using mobile data on my phone to do this presentation tonight, so hopefully everything still runs smoothly. But our speaker tonight is Dr. Michael Waters, talking about Ice Age explorers, the archaeological and genetic evidence for the initial peopling of the Americas. As always, please go ahead at this time and mute yourselves. Um, and also, if you're gonna be like walking around and doing lots of stuff, like visually speaking, then you might want to turn your cameras off too. And with that, I give the floor to you, Michael.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And so I'll give you kind of a quick tour of the story of the first Americans, from the archaeology to the genetics. And so let's go ahead and get started then. So basically, some of the things I want to go over today, and these are the kinds of questions we've been trying to answer for well over 100 years, but let's just take the last 100 years here. And we want to know, who were the first Americans? Where did they come from? When did they arrive into the Americas, and how did they get here? And then once they got here, we'd like to know more about them and how the process in which they settled the Americas and explored it, and then eventually came, to occupy different areas across North, Middle, and South America. So basically, let's just start with a little history of Paleo-Indian archaeology and first Americans archaeology. And, prior to 1927, if you would have asked an archaeologist how long people been in the Americas, they might say 6,000 years, but that all changed with the work of Figgins and Cook. And they were going around from the Denver Museum of Natural History looking at a lot of different archaeological sites. Nothing was panning out until they hit the Folsom site in 1927 in New Mexico. And there they found what we now call Folsom projectile points associated with extinct bison antiquus remains. And here you see some of their excavations there. At the time, there was no way to radiocarbon date or date this material. The fact that it was associated with extinct animals said that it was old. A geological estimate by Kirk Bryan, a well-known geoarchaeologist, geomorphologist, dated it roughly between 10 and 20,000 years ago. Today we know it's roughly around 12,500, 12,600 years old. Okay, so that really pushed back the time frame of the first Americans. And then not too long after, 1934, was the famous Clovis discovery near, again, Clovis, New Mexico, and in Blackwater Draw, in a gravel sand quarry area, were found this other type of projectile point known as a Clovis point. That's what it's right here. It's a much more robust lanceolate spear point with a central fluke coming out of the middle of it. And most important than that, it was also associated with mammoth remains, okay? And this became known as, a separate complex that was, much older than Folsom. And in fact, eventually in Blackwater Draw, they did discover a bison horizon here with Folsom material overlying the Clovis, clearly indicating that Clovis was older. At that particular locality, they were very fortunate to have a geoarchaeologist working there by the name of Ernst Antevs, and he had developed a way to estimate the ages of archaeological sites. He called it geologic climatic dating, and he actually estimated that the Clovis material was somewhere between 12 and 13,000 years old, which is pretty amazing because today, the only date that we have from Blackwater Draw may indicate that it roughly dates to about 12,900 years ago. But since that time, more and more Clovis sites, were found across North America. And eventually, as we all know, Clovis became entrenched and known as the oldest archaeological complex in North America. And so let's go ahead and start with an exploration of Clovis first and ask ourselves, okay, so what is Clovis? All right. And I like to use the definition that Mike Collins provides. It's an archaeological complex, and it's recognized by a very distinctive set of tools and technologies. And those technologies are first biface technology, like you see here, where you take a stone and you work it down bifacially. This happens to be Edwards Church from the Galt site. Work it into a preform, and you're trying to maintain the length, and the width and reduce the thickness of the point, get to the preform stage, and then finally the final projectile point. There was also blade technology, and special cores were created, like this blade core you see right here, and long, slender flakes that we call blades were removed. And these were very useful tools to the Clovis people because they could turn them into end scrapers, like you see here. I've seen denticulated tools. I've seen knives made out of these things, and I've just seen where the blades were snapped and utilized. Okay. So again, very, very important. Again, this is Edwards Church from the Galt site. I was very fortunate to work at the Galt site on a Clovis workshop area, excavation area 8, with Harry Schaefer and, of course, Mike Collins. But also, Clovis had osseous technology. They made osseous projectile points like you see here, where they utilized bone and antler and ivory. And they also made these bibeveled rods, which could have been used to hold the Clovis projectile point. They may have been foreshafts or perhaps served some other purpose that we don't know yet. So now knowing what Clovis looks like, the next thing we want to know is, well, how old is Clovis? And that's one thing that bothered me for a long time, was how old was Clovis? Because when you looked at the Clovis date records, a lot of numbers were just thrown out there. How, 13,500 to 12,500 years ago, and various other iterations of that. And then you looked at the Clovis database, you looked at the dates that have been generated, and they've been generated from archaeological sites, for at least 30 years, using different technologies and different ways of pre-treating specimens, and only some with atomic accelerators. So years ago, we did a project to redate a lot of these Clovis archaeological sites, and we did. And when we did this, we got quite a surprise. And that is that the reliably dated Clovis archaeological sites scattered across the United States, basically, date roughly from about 13,050 to 12,750 calendar years before present, or a short 300-year time window. Now, some people say, well, that's only because you've dated these sites, and they may not represent the earliest or the latest Clovis sites. Well, that's possible. But I always like to say that data is king, and this is what the data is telling us right now. I know some archaeologists have run statistical models, that basically state that Clovis is older. Some people use dubious evidence to claim that Clovis is older than this, but I've yet to see a viable age older than about 13,000, 13,050 for Clovis. Okay. So where is Clovis found? It's primarily found in what is now the United States. The highest densities of Clovis lie east of the Mississippi River, and a lot of Clovis material there. Moderate densities in the plain states up to the edge of the Rocky Mountains. And then once you get over the Rocky Mountains, the densities of Clovis material become much less. And as you push to the south, you find Clovis going into Baja California a little bit, and the Sonora, Chihuahua, but really no Clovis material has ever been found much farther south than the Valley of Mexico. In fact, not a single Clovis point has ever been found in the Valley of Mexico, basically where Mexico City is. But there are some dribs and drabs of things that may suggest that Clovis was south of that, maybe in Central America, maybe in Venezuela, but that evidence currently is fairly not substantiated right now with any dated sites or any good excavations. So pretty much it's confined to the United States. Another thing that we found over time is that Clovis sure seems to have some contemporaries. A lot of new work's been done out in the Intermountain West and the Great Basin, and especially at Paisley Caves, and by Dennis Jenkins. And there he discovered that there was, I think he had dated 4 stemmed points, casket points, and they dated roughly between about 12,800 and 13,000 years ago. And by roughly dated, I mean he had them bracketed in time. And so if you just take the minimum ages that these could be, they were dating at least 13,000 years ago, the same age as Clovis. So it looks like these stem points were the same or are the same age as Clovis. You go down to the southern tip of South America, and there are three cave sites, on the eastern part of the southern cone, and also an open air site, Santa Julia, over on the west coast. And they all date around 13,000 to 12,900 years ago. And these appear to be unifacial industries and appear to be associated with fishtail projectile points. Although the closest that we have to a fishtail projectile point is this, which may be a preform of one, but we just have to wait and see. Most of the fishtails, I think the earliest ones are about 12,800, 12,900 years ago. Okay, so the next thing is that we want to know is, basically who is Clovis? And there's only one known Clovis burial, and that was at the Anzac site. And that particular burial was located right here, and the edge of this slope right here, this is a sandstone bluff, and down in the kind of talus deposits here is where that burial was found. We know that it dates between about 12,850 and 12,750 years ago, so the tail end of the Clovis time period. We know that it was a child burial, a male child, only about 1 year to maybe 1.5 years old. The grave goods there were about 100 Clovis lithic artifacts, including preforms, projectile points, and of course, these bone rods that were made of elk, by the way, some of the oldest elk that's been found in North America. And also everything was covered. The bones and the artifacts, were covered with red ochre. So red ochre was ground up as a powder and put within this burial. Unfortunately, it was dug by amateurs who were gathering up stones for a kind of I guess it was a leach line for a new high school. And they didn't tell anybody about what they found. They just kind of took it out of the ground. Unfortunately, they didn't take any pictures. But, at least it got preserved. And the owner of the property, Mr. Anzac, made sure it all got back together and was a good steward of that material. Well, we were able, some years ago to, get a hold of that specimen by partnering with the Anzac family and as well as tribal people. And we were able to do the first genome that was ever done on an individual, from North America. The oldest genome at that point had been done in Greenland. This is the first one that was done in North America. And what this genome showed us, and by the way, when I'm talking about a genome, we're talking about looking at you get population history from the genome. And in the genome, there's one genome for each cell rather than mitochondrial DNA where you have thousands of cells, for one cell, thousands of copies of that mitochondrial DNA. So this is really what tells you about populations, is genomic information. But what we found was, okay, so here's a map, here's Anzac, and we found that Anzac was directly ancestral to all modern living populations. In other words, all modern living indigenous people living in North, Middle, and South America can trace their ancestry back to this individual, or this family, I should say. And the other thing that it showed was that Clovis, and by the way, this is a heat map. And so here's Anzac. Then the bright red colors means all these people here, ancient individuals and modern individuals, are directly related to Anzac. And as you can see, these kind of orange and yellow colors, golden colors, that indicates kind of a cousin-like relationship, still a strong relationship, but not as strong as what's to the south. And as you go across into Asia, you can see these blue colors, again, indicating ancestry from this region. And then it goes black, and this means there's no connection whatsoever to people living in this area over here. Okay? And the other thing, as I say, that Anzac showed was that Clovis and modern native peoples are derived from a single source population that came from Asia. We'll talk about that in a minute. And one of the things that this specimen told us, or this individual told us, was that the population, once it entered, split into two groups. One that moved south very rapidly and one that stayed up here to the north, kind of staying up close to what would have been the ice sheets up in here. Okay, they were known as the northern and the southern branches. The other thing that this also indicated to us was that there was a deeper time depth of human occupation of the Americas, indicating that Clovis could not be the first people to arrive to the Americas. Well, since ANZIC was done about 20, 25 years ago, we have a much greater or much clearer genetic record for the first Americans. And again, this is all based on genomic information from Kennewick man, from Spirit Cave man or woman, and many others, across, North America as well as South America. And if you look at this, is kind of the family tree here. And so here's the kind of the key elements. You basically have ancestral East Asians kind of, coming and moving along. And a big split takes place around 24,000 years ago. This is when the ancestral Native American lineage actually begins to emerge. And also the other split that comes off here, these become what we call the ancient Paleo-Siberians. Okay, these would be the people that were basically Duktai and others in Siberia. But roughly from 24,000 to 21,000 years ago, this ancestral population continued to receive a lot of gene flow from what they call ancient northern Siberians. And these would have been the people who lived up at Yana and also at Malta. And in other words, which would have been these kind of ancestral Eurasians that stretched across, that part of the area. Okay, a major event occurred around 21,000 years ago. This is when ancient Beringians branched off. We know this from the work of Ben Potter at the Upward Sun site. That's where he found those infant burials. And they again show this branching off of ancient Beringians. It was at this point that the ancestral native population was created 21,000 years ago, eventually moved south of the continental ice sheet somehow. And they got south of the ice sheets around 15,700 years ago and split into what we call the northern branch and the southern branch. And it was the southern branch that moved very rapidly and populated all of the Americas, the United States, going south into Central America, and eventually reaching the southern tip of South America. But this process began at least by 15,700 years ago. Okay, so we've learned a lot from not only ANZIC started to tell the tale, but all these other genomes have now clarified that story. So what does the archaeological and genetic record tell us? Okay, that we've just kind of gone over about Clovis and Clovis contemporaries and the genetic record, and that people must have been in the Americas long before Clovis. Okay, and there's, as we all know, there's a lot of debate and drama, around archaeological sites dating older than Clovis. And really the first that became widely accepted was that of the Monteverdi site that Tom Dillahay excavated and reported on back in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And we now recognize it as being about 14,200 years old. So if people are all the way in the southern tip of South America by 14,200 years ago, there should be some evidence of these people, somebody up there in North America, but where is it? Well, one of the things I embarked on was trying to go back to archaeological sites that I thought had a lot of promise that I learned about in graduate school when I was going through school. I went to the University of Arizona and studied with Vance Haynes. I had the very good fortune of studying with Vance Haynes. I got all my training in geology, but he taught me the rigors of scientific investigation of archaeological sites and the importance of geoarchaeology and dating. And then I lived with a well-known archaeologist, Julian Hayden, and at his house, and he was a staunch believer in pre-Clovis. So I got Clovis by day and pre-Clovis by night. So, but anyway, I've always been enamored with some of these early sites and thought, the way to do this is to go to known archaeological sites that still had a lot of promise. So one of those sites I went to was the Osceola River. I went to the Osceola River in Florida. And along the Osceola River, which is located here, starts in Georgia and flows down to the coast. it's a really interesting river system in that it has a surface flow here, okay? But sometimes it goes underground, emerges as sinkholes, comes to the surface, goes underground, and then emerges as the surface, okay? And then the whole channel is composed of nothing more than sinkholes and then kind of shallow areas and another sinkhole, just kind of linked, one to another. And one of the important sinkholes there was the Page-Ladson site. And this was excavated, as I'll point out to you here, in the 1970s and 80s. Really important site. And I wanted to go back there. And that all happened is one day I got a call from Mr. Ladson, who owns the property, and he said, well, if you come out to talk to me, I'll give you permission to dig there. And I said, whoa, okay, I'm there. I'm coming, So, but anyway, one thing I want to point out to you is here's where Page-Ladson is today. And I'm going to show you the site is roughly almost 15,000 years old. 15,000 years ago, sea level would have been out to here. So actually, Page-Ladson would have been an inland site, about 150 kilometers from the coast. But at any rate, the first work that was done there was done by David Webb and Jim Dunbar. David Webb was a paleontologist. Jim Dunbar was the archaeologist there. They investigated the site from 1983 to 1997. And they defined the stratigraphy of the site, as you can see here, quite a nice stratigraphy here. They found a Bolan, early archaic occupation up in here. And then down in here, they found some of this early archaeological material that they thought dated roughly between about 14,200 to 14,400 years old. They had a tusk that was found there of a mastodon that had cut marks, as you can see here, going around the circumference of the mastodon, a tusk here, okay? This probably was done while they were chipping and cutting away the tusk, because this part of the tusk would have been up in the skull of the mastodon, and they had to cut it out and cut the tendons off that were holding it in place. They also found a few artifacts. Some of these I don't think are artifacts. I think they're geofacts, but they did find some real honest-to-God artifacts when I looked at the collection. And I thought, boy, this is really a good place to look for early archaeological evidence. And because we have stratigraphy there, we can radiocarbon date this site, and we can actually find material in situ if we get lucky. So I was very fortunate in that we were able to do excavations starting in 2012 and continued on through 2014, 2015. And I was very fortunate to have a graduate student by the name of Jesse Halligan, who just, was about ready to graduate. And I said, how would you like a postdoc? Because I'm not a diver and I don't dig underwater. Although I did take my first dive at the Page-Ladson site, which was really interesting. And because I said, well, if I'm going to write this up with you, I've got to know what this stuff looks like. So I took it to my first dive there. But at any rate, you may ask yourself, well, how do you dig underwater? Okay, and you got to remember this was once a terrestrial site. Sea level was lower. It was an inland site. At the time the site was occupied, the water table would have dropped. There would have been no flow through that Osceola River. The actual sinkhole would have been dry, and there would have been pond at the bottom of it. So that's why people and animals could come there, by the way. But now as sea level rose and water tables rose, it inundated the archaeological site and covered it up with water. So it's buried, it's under about 25 feet of water. But how do you dig underwater? It's just like you dig on land. It's just a little bit more costly and time consuming. You set up a grid system. You set up a green laser system so that you can get your elevations on a datum. You dig with trowels, and instead of taking up buckets, you just kind of have a hose here that sucks it up to the dredge, and then it gets onto a screen deck, and because you do all your screening over here, okay? And so that's how we dug at the archaeological site. The first year, not so good because we were chased out by hurricanes, had to come back, a lot of flooding. Second year was a gold mine, so that was great. So I'll tell you about the good part. So basically, in the last 2 years that we excavated there, we were able to confirm the stratigraphy that was presented by Dunbar and Webb. We also confirmed the dating. We got 71 radiocarbon dates, and we also confirmed the early archaeology there. We got very, very lucky And that during the excavation, as we were digging through these sediments, we paid very close attention when we were in that unit 3 to dig very slowly and very carefully. And I'll never forget the day that this happened. Is one of the divers, who's now graduate, another one of my students, Morgan Smith, came boiling up to the surface and said, "We found a biface." And I thought, holy cow, that's wonderful. I was just hoping for a flake. And so Jessie was throwing on her tanks to go back down. And I said, okay, well, what we want to do is just, head off every, kind of criticism at the past. Just take that biface, consider it to be the nucleus of an atom, and we're going to date all of this material that we can date around that biface. And that's exactly what we did, and dates above and below. So a little overkill on the dates, but it had to be done to demonstrate that everything was in situ. When we did this particular biface, as well as some of the other tools that we took out of the site, we can show date to 14,600 years ago. So definitely a very old, at least 1,600 years older than Clovis. Here's that biface, and here's an artist's rendition of what that sinkhole would have looked like, the shallow pond, animals coming down to get water. You got water, you got animals, you got humans there. Okay? So really interesting stuff. Good site. Well, another site that always intrigued me was that of the Manus site in Washington State. It was dug by a guy named Carl Gustafson, and he was at Washington State for a number of years. And he excavated this site from 1977 to 1979. And it was found in a kettle pond on a till plain here. So this is all glacial till, and there's a small pond here. And in this pond here, Mr. Manus was digging with his backhoe, and he encountered this mastodon. And so he asked if there was anybody interested in looking at an archaeological site at this archaeologically. And Carl came right forward and said, yes, I want to do this. So he began excavating. And he found basically the remains of one mastodon. And he found that most of the bones of the left side were still articulated over here, while the bones of the right side were moved kind of upslope to the edge of the pond. He defined the stratigraphy of the site, with Mazama ash and radiocarbon dates on organic material, and came to the conclusion that this specimen, this particular elephant, had to be around 14,000 years old. By the way, there's the site right there in the Olympic Peninsula. Well, the key artifact that he didn't find any stone tools, but instead what he found is he found what appeared to be something embedded in one of the ribs of the mastodon. So here it is. Here's the thing embedded in here. So here's another close-up view of this thing embedded in here. Okay, so here's kind of a CT shot of this thing embedded in here. And you can see that it penetrates about 2.5 centimeters in here. There's a lot of fragments of it. And there appears to be some healing that took place after these fragments were injected in here. And then here's a 3D rendering we did at one point in time to show you this same fragment right here going in and this part broken off. So a lot of people looked at this evidence and said, oh, well, I should have mentioned too at Page-Latson. I mean, Dunbar and Webb just were ignored. And then there hasn't been a single peep of criticism of our work at Page-Latson. But so here at this particular site, they said, oh, no, this is not anything. This is just something natural that happened. And we'll talk about some of that in a minute here. But anyway, so I just called up Carl. I found him on Google, and I called him up and I said, hey, Carl, you still have the bones? And he said, yeah, I still do. Do you still have the rib? And he said, yeah, I do. So you mind if we study it? And he goes, no, you can have it. I'll mail it right down to you. Okay. So he mailed me down the rib, So the first thing we did is we wanted to find out, was this a bone point? So which rib was it? That's the first thing we needed to find out. It turns out it's the 14th rib over here on the right. So clearly a shot could be made, okay? It wasn't covered up by a scapula, or there wasn't a lot of something else to go through here and kind of deflect any kind of projectile. Next thing was, what's the age of this specimen? We dated some of this bone, some of the other bone, and it all came out 13,900 years ago, okay? We did DNA analysis of the embedded piece material here. It was mastodon. Okay. Very interesting. Okay. Well, from our initial study, we got a little bit more criticism. So over COVID, I had a student work on this to isolate the fragments, and with a more high resolution CT scan. And what we did is we did micro CT scan, not a CT scan like you get in the hospital. With a micro CT scanner, these are scanners that are used in paleontology, but also they were developed for engineering. Like for example, nuclear power plants, they have to make sure the welds are perfect. So they put them into this kind of high resolution CT scanner to scan every bit of that weld to make sure the weld has no imperfections in it. And so that's paleontologists use this all the time to CT scan skeletons of all sorts of things, fetal dinosaurs and bones of dinosaurs, eggs of dinosaurs, other things. So at any rate, we put this through that micro CT scan and we got scans that were the width of a piece of paper. Okay, so imagine that, the width of a piece of paper. That's how thick these scans were, one stacked on the other. In all, we've got 3 axes coming in with 3,000 images. And it took the student 500 hours, to go through each image and isolate each foreign fragment in that bone and isolate it, and then take the next slice, do the same thing. But slowly and surely, by doing that, we were able to isolate 24 fragments. When we isolated the 24 fragments, we printed them out on a 3D printer, high resolution printer that we have at A&M. And then what we did is we just looked at it and started putting together like a jigsaw puzzle, and the thing fit together just like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, we could tell where they went because there would be like a curved edge, and there'd be a curved edge, and part of it would be convex and concave, and the piece would just kind of snap into place like mending a pot. And when we did this, this is the object that we created. Okay, here's the scale here. But I want you to take a look at this and look at this thing. It has a kind of a plano-convex cross-section to it. And we have 2 edges of it right over here. Okay? By the way, this is that long piece that came in here. That little piece is that little piece right there. And you can kind of see how it all fits together. So that's really interesting. Okay? So what does this represent? Okay? Well, what we think it represents is it represents a bone projectile point. I think Carl Gustafson was absolutely right, because this thing has a plano-convex cross-section to it. Now, the thing is that you have to ask yourself is there, and let's just play devil's advocate and ask ourselves, is there any bone in a mastodon that is that delicate? Let's just say that's an exterior, that's the exterior portion of a bone within a mastodon. And the answer to that is no, there is no bone that delicate anywhere in a mastodon, okay? Even the smallest bones in a mastodon are the tongue bones, the hyoids, and even they are very robust, okay? So it's clearly a foreign bone. Okay, another thing that was really interesting, the CT scans were such high resolution that we were able to define osteons. And this is where the blood vessels go through these canals and nerves, and blood vessels go through the bone. And we could see how they were growing through time, okay? And the only place you get this density of osteons and growth pattern like this is the leg bone of a mastodon. So this had to have come from the leg bone of another mastodon. So clearly, plano-convex cross-section, wide here, tapering to a point. It's kind of blows your mind, but it's real, okay? Now, there were several hypotheses. Gary Haynes said it was an angry elk that just kind of gored the elephant while it was sleeping. Obviously, it's not that because it's not an elk. Other people said, oh, it was injected by the backhoe. Well, if that were the case, this would be very loose. There'd be sand grains in here because it's very muddy in there. And that just wasn't the case. And in fact, you can kind of see this kind of patterning of the roots across the bone. Well, that same patterning went all over this specimen. You can see, you could just trace the pattern almost like camouflage kind of coming up across the bone. So it was clearly wasn't a backhoe. Then they came up with the imaginative idea that, okay, there are two elephants fighting one another for, the females. And, again, this can't be the case because, again, the way the force is on a rib, that if you when elephants are fighting and they hit one another, it's gonna push the bone in and break it, and you're gonna get a well-known kind of fracture known as a butterfly fracture, but it's gonna be held in place by the periosteum, kind of like a saran wrap that surrounds your bones. Okay. And besides that, it's not going to have a plano convex cross section. So at any rate, so those are all red herrings there. It's clearly a bone projectile point dating to roughly about 13,900 years ago. The last site I want to take you to here let's go to Buttermilk Creek. Okay, this is an important site here in Central Texas. Up in the headwaters area is the Galt site excavated by Mike Collins. We were able to excavate that Clovis workshop about right up in here, excavation area 8. And then we began work downstream at what we call the Deborah L. Friedkin site. Here's Buttermilk Creek, small little creek, spring fed, never goes dry. And here's the floodplain area across from the Friedkin, across from the river, little creek. We excavated up here on one of the terraces. Okay, it was where we did our excavations. Here's Buttermilk Creek here. Here's some of our excavations underway. And at this particular site, unfortunately, we didn't have any stratigraphy, but we did have diagnostic artifacts. And when we excavated through this archaeological site year after year after year, we found that you would find the late prehistoric artifacts, projectile points at the top. You would find below this the late archaic material. Below this, middle archaic. Below this, we would find the early archaic material, Angostura, Wells, Hoxie, etc. We found then late Paleoindian material below it, Angostura, Golondrina, Dalton, St. Mary's Hall. Below this, we had Folsom. Below that, we had Clovis. Here's Clovis, Clovis, and Clovis Blaze and end thinning flakes, okay? And then below this, more artifacts, all right? And we call this the Buttermilk Creek Complex. And after you go through this 15, 20 centimeters and get to the end of it, you don't find any more artifacts in the much older sediments. So clearly, the diagnostic artifacts are telling us that this material, is pretty much in place. Now, unfortunately, there's nothing to radiocarbon date at this site, so we turned to utilizing the luminescence dating technique. And here's Steve Foreman, who's at Baylor University, and he would come out and do our OSL dating. We would do columns. We did 4 columns and miscellaneous samples across the excavation every year. And all in all, got about 78 OSL ages over that time period. And what's interesting is the OSL ages corresponded quite nicely with the late prehistoric, the early archaic, the dates from the late Paleo-Indian time period, the dates for Folsom, Clovis, and here are some of the dates that we got from the Buttermilk Creek complex. And then the older deposits are, as you can see, much older than that. And so we determined that the Buttermilk Creek complex is about 13,500 to about 15,500 years old. All right, so what does this stuff look like? What do these artifacts look like? There's bifaces there, bifacial preforms and other bifaces. There's chopping-like tools there. There's cores, these kind of discoidal cores that we have there. A lot of expedient tools such as spoke shaves, gravers, side scrapers here. Here's a biface. It has snap fractures on it. We have some blades here. We found, red ochre there. This was a large piece of ochre. You can see the facet on the ochre here. And I forget when the student found it, he says, Dr. Waters, I found a shiny rock. And I said, let me come see. And then so I went down there. I said, that's a heck of a great shiny rock. That's ochre, and so we collected that. But what's interesting is we also found these kind of bend break type tools or radially broken tools where they would do these snap fractures like you see here and here, both on bifaces as well as on flakes. We've done a lot of use wear analysis on these, and the use wear on these indicates that they were utilized for scraping bone and antler, ivory, and perhaps horn cores, etc. So really great tools that could be used to do the job of, say, a burin almost. Okay. Now, also too, during our excavations, we did find some projectile points in the lower levels, and all the ones that were down here in the lowest levels, like this point right here, which is here, okay, were stemmed projectile points. When I first saw this, I thought, we'd found bits and pieces of points, but it wasn't until about the fifth or sixth year that we actually found a complete point. And when I had that, then I knew what everything else was. And and uh, and it was very surprising to find that, but I said, okay, well, I expected something else, but in archaeology, you have to keep an open mind and you get what you get, and you have to figure out what it is and just report what you find. So here again, we found this great stem point, and then we found preforms, and then we found midsection fragments and tips of other ones throughout the excavation area. And above this, below the Clovis horizon, we did find this oddball shaped, kind of almost triangular lanceolate point. You can see where it was hafted here, and then it was a heavily beveled and kind of end-thinned a little bit. So who knows? Maybe this is some kind of proto-Clovis type projectile point. But we only have one, and so just kind of interesting at this stage of the game. I want to point out too, one thing that's kind of cool about this working in Buttermilk Creek is at the same time we were working at the Friedkin site, you had Mike Collins was working over at the Galt site, specifically Area 15. And at Area 15, he had this great, wonderful sequence with, again, late prehistoric, late archaic material, middle, early archaic material, late Paleoindic material, Clovis. Then he had kind of a zone, not truly a sterile zone, but a zone that didn't have many artifacts in it. And then what he had, what he called the older than Clovis material. And he had bifaces, he had blades just like we had, he had various kinds of tools like we had, and he had points, and all the points that he found were stemmed points. Okay. So again, very important, to have this kind of information, from the Galt site. And what I think is very powerful is that you have Mike Collins working at the Galt site independently, different geologists, different geochronologists, we're working at the Friedkin site, different crew, different people doing the dating, and we come basically to the same conclusions and find similar things. So to me, that's really nice confirmation that what we were finding was truly in situ, and there's many other things I could talk about. So basically, I've kind of taken you on a quick tour and of a few sites. I mentioned Monteverdi. I took you here to Pays Ladson, the Friedkin site, and the Manus site. But you should also know that up in Idaho, Lauren Davis has the Cooper's Ferry site. This has 14,500 years ago. This is kind of an old slide. I need to update it. Now he has these things going back, these stem type projectile points going all the way back to almost 16,000 years ago. At Paisley Caves in Oregon, over in here, you have human coprolites and artifacts that were found by Dennis Jenkins there 14,100 years ago. There's even I think it's Crypt Cave in Nevada, had, caches of grasshoppers in a cave, and those again dated to roughly around 14,000 years ago. Of course, you have Wally's Beach up here in Canada, dating 13,300 years ago, with multiple horse kills, one camel kill, all dating 13,300 years ago. Wisconsin, you have two woolly mammoths, the Schaefer site and the Heber site, again dating fairly old, 14,500, 14,800 years ago, associated with bifaces and other artifacts. And of course, I put a question mark here, maybe Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. We just need to look at the final report, see what the final dates are, and which Jim Audavazio is currently working on now. Okay. So in other words, we now have a pretty good constellation of early sites, up here in what is now presently the United States. So essentially what this begs for is it begs for a new model of the peopling of the Americas, where Clovis is no longer king and truly the first people that entered the Americas, and we kind of know who these people were now grossly from the genetics. We know where they kind of came from, not specifically, but we know somewhere in Northeast Asia. When did they arrive? The genetic evidence is telling us anywhere between 17,500 years ago to maybe 14,600 years ago. That's when that southern and northern split took place. Okay. We have the empirical archaeological evidence indicating that people were here by 16,000 years ago at the Cooper's Ferry site. Again, I'm sorry it's not on here. Galt and Friedkin, and then, various other sites that I mentioned to you. Here's Paisley Ladson. Here's Paisley Caves. Okay. And then with later sites showing up in South America, just like you would imagine. You may ask yourself, how did they get south of the ice sheets? We really don't have time to talk about that, but I can tell you that what's really interesting is over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, geologists for some reason got really interested in both corridors and generated a lot of evidence. And their geological evidence indicated that the inland corridor, often referred to as the ice-free corridor, really didn't geologically open until maybe 13,800 years ago. And it really wasn't until about 13,200 years ago that it became viable. We know that because we know that, again, from genetics, we see northern clade bison coming from Alaska down to Edmonton, and southern clade bison from the plains, northern plains, moving back up the corridor into Alaska. And that happens at around 13,200 years ago. There's other evidence as well. So it opens up really late. But now the coastal corridor appears to be opening up really early. It looks like the Cordilleran ice sheet is retreating rapidly, is definitely gone, from the coastline by maybe in a lot of areas by 16,000 years ago. Animals like bears, for instance, started coming in and hunting sea mammals by that time. So this corridor is opened by 16,000 years ago and maybe even a little earlier. So logic is telling us that if people got in here this early, then more than likely they had to come along the coast because the ice-free corridor or inland corridor was not open. And then we're starting to realize that these complexes are more contemporaneous than they are different in time. Because we need a lot more evidence from this time period as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop. I'll just put in a plug for the center here. I run the Center for the Study of the First Americans. If you want to learn more about us, you can go to our website, www.centerfirstamericans.com. And also, too, I'd like to announce, and this is the first time that I'm making this announcement here to any group here, is that in 2013, we had what was known as the Paleo-American Odyssey Conference in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Rob Bonix and my predecessor had various other conferences. He had the World Summit Conference, Clovis and Beyond in Santa Fe. And so we kind of are carrying on that tradition. Well, our last one was in 2013. And so here we are 13 years later, having one in Santa Fe again in 2026. We're going to have 13 plenary kind of speakers coming and talking about everything from the genetics of the first Americans over a 3-day period. The earliest records in Beringia, moving on to talk about perhaps, LGM, occupation of the Americas, talking about a lot of these pre-Clovis sites, many others, domestication of dog and the first Americans, moving on and looking at South America, and then kind of looking at the Younger Dryas time period. So, and there'll be more information about that on our Facebook site, and out there in social media and magazines, and also too, we're starting to advertise it on our website, probably in the coming months. But consider coming. We had 1,100 people come last time, so which kind of was a combination of avocationalists and interested people. A lot of people from groups like yours came, and you can meet all these people. We're going to have about 400 poster sessions there, so they'd be able to look at 400 posters of research going on into the first Americans. Again, Santa Fe, New Mexico, October 14th to 17th, 2026. So look for more information. So with that plug, I'll go ahead and I'll stop there and entertain questions. I'm sure there's some questions out there, and I'm happy to entertain it, because that's actually the most fun part of the conversation.
So it looks like Scott did put a question in the chat. Why do you think it took so long to find and verify that there were sites older than Clovis besides Monteverde, Manus, and possibly Meadowcroft?
Um, yeah, it was a lot of I a lot of early sites that were presented, at that time. Clovis, what happened was Clovis was identified. It really didn't get defined until about 1952, 1954. It was Seller's book. And then people started finding more and more Clovis all over the place. Then radiocarbon dating, comes on board in the 60s, and they're able to really radiocarbon date this material. And a very elegant model was built very rapidly about, moving through the ice-free corridor and rapidly moving across the continents. And and uh, and so a lot of the early evidence that was presented for early occupation was rather weak. And for sites, you have to have definite artifacts, you have to have good stratigraphy, and you have to have excellent dating. And in many cases, a lot of these early sites just did not pass muster, and rightly so. But then there were a lot that got maligned, like Page Lads and Manus and Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and many others. Even the Wisconsin sites were maligned. But when you go back and you start looking at them, I think it was just a preponderance of evidence and the presentation of strong geological context, the advent of accelerated radiocarbon dating where you could get good ages, and going back and actually questioning what is the age of Clovis. All these things combined, I think, help push us over the edge. And then new sites are coming online now, such as the Cooper's Ferry site.
Thank you. So Chris has now said, would you comment on the early age of human footprints at White Sands?
Oh, okay, that's a good one. I'm glad you asked that question because I was going to bring it up if somebody didn't. It used to be in the old days, I get questions about Solutrean hypothesis, but now it's the White Sands. Yeah, the White Sands is an interesting locality. I like the locality because it kind of humanizes the first Americans, and it's very impactful to see those footprints. But I think, I'm skeptical at this stage it's this stage. When I first read the article, I thought this is cool. They have footprints and they have these seeds, which should be excellent for dating. And they got some, decent radiocarbon dates, small standard deviations. But then you start digging a little and probing into what the evidence is. And one of the things, I think they suffer from two things. The problem is site formation issues. I don't think those were ever adequately described. And by that I mean, what was the depositional environment there, and why are these footprints there? And if you go back to that article and take a look at it, they always show you the same picture over and over and over again of the footprints. Those footprints were found very close to the surface. Go back and look at the article. They're buried by about 1 centimeter to maybe 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters at the most. Okay. And those are great footprints. Take a look at the picture. Wait a minute. Some of the footprints are positive. In other words, they're kind of emergent from the ground, like casts, and others are depressions into the ground. Well, wait a minute. For that casting to happen, you have to have deposition and then some kind of, fossilization, for lack of a better term, of the print itself and the material, in the depression. And then when it's excavated, you're getting the positive footprint, but there's negative footprints around it too. And that doesn't quite fit with a site formation story. And the other thing is that's one of the most active depositional places on the planet with constant erosion and deposition taking place. If you have this much deposition at the top covering 98%, 99% of those footprints, that could easily be slope wash, okay? That could be Holocene in age and redepositing those rupia seeds. That takes me to the next problem at White Sands, and that's the dating of rupia seeds, Okay. In their articles, they just flatly say, well, let me back up for a minute. What is a rupia? It's also known as ditchweed. Rupia is a plant that grows in water. When you have a plant that grows in water, it's known as a hydrophyte, okay, or water-loving plant, which means that it's getting all of its carbon from the water around it. Okay, it's not getting it from the atmosphere like normal plants, which we use all the time for radiocarbon dating. Uh, and instead, it's getting it from the water. So you have to worry about whether or not the water was in equilibrium with the atmosphere. Okay, it's called the hard water effect or the reservoir effect. And in that area, it's surrounded by gypsum and it's surrounded by carbonates and other materials. So there's got to be older carbon floating around in the system. You start researching rupia and you discover that it's known by lacustrine scholars, people who study lake sequences, they say it's not reliable because of the reservoir issues that are there. And in other words, they're dating older. And there was an interesting study that was done by I think it was Dave Rohde, I think did it, or someone, one of the other people did it. They found a sample that was curated at an arboreum that was collected in 1948 from that basin. They dated it, collected in 1948, and it dated to 8,000 years ago when it's calibrated. Wait a minute. How can that shows you how much carbon, dead carbon, radiometrically dead carbon was in the plant. And but they emphatically say there was no reservoir effect in the rupia they're dating. So they're just trying to tell us that for some reason where the footprints are located, this little tiny spot is a unicorn where basically the rules of how this plant lives and where it gets its carbon from don't apply. And I just don't believe that. Then you start looking at the delta C13s and the nitrogen values and the carbon values, and they clearly show there's a reservoir issue. Now, that being said, I want to just say that work that was done on the geochemistry of reservoir effects back in the 1950s by a real smart guy. His name was Wally Broker, real smart, one of the smartest guys that ever lived in geology. And he calculated out that basically a reservoir effect could be no more than one radiocarbon half-life. Okay, what is that? That's about 6,000 years roughly. Okay, so if you just even take the ages they have now, which are 22, 23,000 years ago, and subtract that off of that, and then calibrate those ages, they match the ages that I was talking about today. So those things some of them are probably old, dating at least at the time of Clovis. Some of them maybe back to 16,000 years ago. But until that reservoir effect and reservoir problem is resolved, we just won't have the true story there. And until the site formation study is figured out, we're not going to get the true story there. And so, it's a really interesting site. It's a really interesting problem, and another thing too is think back to the genetic record of the first Americans that I talked about. What was happening at 23,000 years ago? The American population had just branched off from ancestral Eurasians, and it was still receiving gene flow from that, northern Siberian population until 21,000 years ago. How is it possible that those sites could be that old? If they are that old, they're just a footnote in the story. They have nothing to do with people in the Americas, nothing to do. Well, they just kind of got here, but they never passed on their genetic material to any modern living descendants that we have today. So that Hopi woman that was shown in the documentaries and stuff, those were not her ancestors. Those are truly 23,000 years old. So.
All right, and then this will have to be our last question for Q&A, just so we can stay on schedule. Justin Phillips has asked in the chat, in Folsom and Clovis, we see a lot of similarities in tools. Often you can't distinguish between Clovis and Folsom tools. Do you see the same similarities in technology with pre-Clovis and Clovis?
Oh, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah, in some regards, well, we have stem points instead of lancelet points. We have, discoidal cores, and some blade cores. So yeah, in that regard, yeah, the blade cores, especially shown at Galt, for instance, and the bifaces, show similar flaking techniques, and so there is a lot of similarity and overlap, end scrapers, for instance, and so I would have to say that the material that we have from the Friedkin site, and definitely the material from the Clovis site at the Gulf, probably are could be, if we get some more sites and really look at this, kind of similar to what's found in the Clovis material. And so that's a good question. And that's kind of the thing that we'd like to work on more. Currently, what I'm doing is I'm in the process now of getting everything organized in my lab, getting all the artifacts pulled, and all the information taken care of so that we can prepare a book about the Friedkin site and, hopefully do that in the next year here. We have almost everything now organized, ready to go. We have the analyses complete, and now we're going to start analyzing that material.
All right, well, thank you so much, Michael. It was a great presentation.